what a pleasure it is to look out and see you, human listeners, instead of a little blinking green light on a computer. I don't know about you, but we found at my house that we went a little feral during lockdown, which is what I think attracted me to these stories about hospitality from around the world. This first is a folktale from Sri Lanka, and you'll hear as it unfolds, starting with its title, The Girl and Her Stepmother, that it is a variant of what we think of as a Cinderella story, but in this tale, the stakes are considerably higher than in Disney. Once, there was a mother. Was she wholly good or wholly bad? I cannot tell you, because she was dead before the story started. It was her job to usher a daughter into the world, and this she did, and then she left it herself. And the girl grew up with her father, a cotton farmer. And they both knew how to and did work hard to grow and harvest the cotton and to make it ready for the market and to make it into cloth themselves as needed. As she grew up, she saw that they needed more pairs of hands at their house. And she was glad when he took another wife and she brought with her a daughter. Now, was the stepmother wholly good or wholly bad? I cannot tell you. It was her job to usher this girl out of her father's life and into her own story. And this she did with small cruelties. Until at last, one day, she set her own daughter up inside the house to clean and comb some cotton, and she sent the cotton farmer's own daughter outside. And she said, "There, you must clean this cotton, and do not lose any. If you lose any, you may not come back inside this house." She worked hard. She worked carefully, but there was a breeze, and it became a gust, and wisps of the cotton blew away until there was nothing left in her hands, and that's when her stepmother came outside and said, "I told you, you may never enter this house again. Go into the woods and beyond to a second forest, and there you will meet a bear. Perhaps she will eat you. Perhaps she will give you a gift. If you survive that second forest, you will find yourself at the palace of the prince with 7 mouths." And so the girl left her father's house, and she walked through the woods she knew. And then she entered a forest that was unknown to her, and it was dark. In that forest, the trees were so heavy and so close together. She walked and walked through those shadows until something rose up in front of her. It was a bear, and it lifted one hand, and she thought that it might maul her. But it reached its paw down and stroked her head as tenderly as her mother might have. And then it gave her 3 gifts: a golden spindle, a golden bow for cleaning cotton, a golden spinning wheel, all packed up in a little case. And then it let her go. And she walked out of that forest and stood before the palace of the prince with 7 mouths. You will not be surprised to know he was an ogre. And all of those mouths hungered for human flesh. Happily, he was not at home. he was out seeking some hapless traveler, she went inside and looked about. It was clear which rooms he used and which he did not. She found a little room, a haven. There was a loom there. It had been neglected for years because he had eaten the weaver. She took her things inside, and then she tidied up his palace. She did what needed to be done. And then she made 7 bowls of rice and 7 curries, and she left those for him on his table and hid herself in her little room. And he came home starving, for there had been no traveler to fall upon. He smelled and saw the rice and curries. He fell upon that. And when he had eaten it all, he said, "Who has done this? Who has done this?" But there was no answer. And he fell upon his bed, and as he slept, one of his mouths disappeared. The next day again, he went out into the world seeking human flesh, and while he was gone, she came from her hiding place, and she did what needed to be done. And then she made 6 bowls of rice and 6 curries, and she left those for him and hid herself. Again, he staggered home so famished, for there was no one traveling there. He saw the curries, he ate them, he called out, "Who has done this? Who has done this?" And there was no answer. He fell upon his bed and slept, and as he slept, a mouth disappeared, and so it went day after day. She made 1 less bowl of rice, 1 less bowl of curry. And each day after he had eaten what she had made for him, he slept, and one of his mouths disappeared. At the end of the days, I am happy to tell you that he only had 1 mouth left, and it did not hunger for human flesh. In fact, he was quite a good-looking man. Still, he left the palace to see what would happen. And she came out of her hiding place and did what needed to be done. When she had tidied that palace, she made a half a bowl of rice and a half a bowl of curry. And then she drew a bath for him. And then she heated some oil that he might anoint himself. And then she took a golden cloth that she had spun and then woven, and she laid it over his bed. Now, where she got the golden thread, I cannot tell you unless she found it inside her own heart. And then she hid herself. And in time he came back. He saw the food and he ate it gratefully. He saw the bath and he bathed himself. He saw the oil and he anointed himself. And he saw the cloth. He said, "Who has done this? Who has done this? Come down, come down. I will not hurt you. Come down." And she came down. And he asked her why she had done these things for him, and she told him her own story. And that when she arrived there, she knew only to do what needed to be done. He took her hands in his, and he looked at them and he said, "These are clever hands. These are compassionate hands. These are the hands of a queen. Would you be my wife?" And she agreed. They were married, and the next day she made 1 bowl of rice and 1 curry, and they ate them together. And they lived there and ruled well, so that when her father and his second wife and her daughter fell on hard times, they made their way through 2 forests to come to that palace and beg for refuge. And they were welcomed. This next is a tiny story, and as far as I can tell, having found it in a book published in 1927, I think it is a variant of a story that was published in the Grimm Brothers' first edition, so it may be related to a German folktale. This one I love all the more. It's called The Sausage and the Mouse. Once there was a sausage and a mouse, and they loved each other like sisters. And so they lived together, and they worked together. Every day, one would leave the house in search of what they needed, and the other would keep the house and make a meal. Now, on this particular day, it was for the mouse to go out and seek what was needed, and the sausage to stay home and cook. She had made a lovely stew of cabbage, and just before it was ready, she climbed inside. And then she got out again, knowing that she had just flavored that cabbage with her own sweet sauce. And when her sister came home, they had a marvelous meal. The next day, it was the mouse's turn to stay home, and the sausage's turn to go out into the world. The mouse said, "That cabbage last night was so good. Why was it so good?" "Well, I climbed into it." "Oh," said the mouse, and watched her sister, the sausage, go out into the world. Well, that day, the mouse made some lentils, tasted them. They needed a little something. And so the little mouse climbed into the pot. And when the sausage came home, she said, "Mousie, my sweet mousie, sister, where are you?" And when she came to the pot of lentils, she saw, the little mouse in the hot water had grown so weak she could not climb out, and she perished at her post. Now, the sausage never recovered from this loss. And it was such a great grief that all her sausage sisters know about it. So that to this day, when you put a sausage into a pan, you hear it pop and sizzle and whisper, "Pop, pop, pop. Poor mouse." Years ago, more than 30 years ago, I was at this festival as a nursing mother. My 31-year-old daughter and my 27-year-old daughter are somewhere on the grounds. And they are alive today because my husband and I were lucky enough to have some wonderful au pairs or nannies. The first we call Saint Natalie. And we include her in everything in our lives that we can, considering that she lives in France. She was the oldest of 25 cousins, and she knew far more about babies than either Berkeley or myself, because we were the youngest children in both our families. This story I'm going to tell you now is a folk tale from Brittany, which is where St. Natalie was born and raised. And it's a tale of the time when the old magic and the new magic came together. On the coast of Brittany, there is a little village called Plouhinec. Now, it has a heath or a moor that overlooks the sea. And the grass on that moor is so wiry that only the local goats can stomach it. No corn can grow there. Happily, there is a river that runs round that heath, and across the river there is wonderful farmland, and in fact, a bounteous farm owned by a farmer and his sister, sweet Rosnique. And every person in the village worked on that farm. And not one of them could remember, because this place was so old, how there happened to be an avenue of standing stones on their heath. None of them could tell you why they were placed there or who had placed them, but they stood with their own secret story. Now, on this farm, there was a worker, a young man with a good heart. His name was Bernays, and truth to tell, he and Rosnique had loved each other since they were children. And they hoped to marry one day, but her brother, the farmer, was clear that that day would not come until Bernays found his fortune, which it seemed unlikely he would do working on this farm. Though he saved every coin that he made, except for the ones he gave in tithes to the church or to a passing pauper. Still, he loved to see Rosnique every day when he went to work, and she loved to glimpse him. And come Christmas Eve, that farm threw all its doors open and set its table for everyone in the village who wished to join them there, for they had fine black bread to break among their neighbors. They had a fragrant stew and some good beer. And as they all sat at table, Bernays sat across from Rosnique, and they were able to steal loving glances at one another throughout the courses of the meal. And as the meal was drawing to an end, there was a knock at the door, and when it was opened, the cold of Christmas Eve blew in, and there was a greater chill too, because standing outside the door was a man who was known as something of a beggar and something of a thief, and someone who perhaps also knew magic. For often when he came through any village, the corn would turn black on the stalks, or the cows would stop giving milk, and if someone who looked healthy dropped dead, they all knew it was because of a curse from this man. So no one wanted to cross him. When he asked to come in and eat the leavings of the meal, he was made welcome. But the rest of the diners made their excuses and went away home. Now, when he'd finished eating, he asked if there might be a place he could sleep. And the farmer said to him, "The best place, I think, is in the stall in the barn, where you'll find my best donkey and my best ox. The straw is clean, and they will help to keep you warm on this cold night." He was happy enough with that offer. And so he went into the barn, and he made his way into that stall, and he dug himself down into the straw. And before he fell asleep, he took as much of the heat from the animals as he could and gave very little back. Before he dozed, he heard the church bells ringing the midnight hour. Now, as you know, there were a donkey and an ox in another stable 2,000 years ago. And because of that, on Christmas Eve at midnight, all of the donkeys and all of the oxen in the world have a moment when they can speak in human voices. And as the beggar lay there in the straw, he heard, "Ah, how have you been this year, my brother?" said the donkey. "As well as you," said the ox. "Ah," said the donkey, "do you know this is a special night? Not just Christmas Eve, but this is the night in 100 years when the stones of Pluinek will rise out of their places and roll down to the river for a drink." "Is that so?" said the ox. "Yes," said the donkey. Now, by now, the beggar was listening carefully, though he pretended to snore. "Once they get out of their places, you know what people can find? Fairy gold in a hoard in each of the places where the stones will rest. But those stones are jealous of their gold, and if they know that you are taking it, they will roll back and crush you. The only thing that will save you," said the donkey, "is a handful of crow's foot and a 5-leaved clover." Said the ox. "Indeed." "Yes," said the donkey, "and more than that, a man's blood must be spilled on the heath. Otherwise, in the morning, that stolen gold will crumble to dust." And that's all they could say in that short space of time when they were granted speech. The beggar, lying in the straw, began to make his plan. And the next morning he got up and he thought it was best to search for the crow's foot and the clover outside of this little town, lest he give away the plan and have other people trying to come and steal the fairy gold. And he must find some fool whose blood he could spill. Well, in the week between Christmas and New Year, which was the day that the stones would move, he sought the crow's foot, he sought the clover, he found them, and he came back to the town. And as he walked across the heath, he saw Bernays there in the last of the light on New Year's Eve, and he was carving a cross into the largest of the stones that stood there on the heath. And the beggar said, "You, what are you doing?" "I'm leaving a sign that I hope will give some solace to a weary traveler." "I see." He looked at Bernays and remembered the loving glances that had escaped him during the dinner the week before. "Are you as poor as I think you are?" "Probably poorer," said Bernays. "And if you had pockets full of gold, what would you do with them?" "Well, I would go and claim the woman I love, for she loves me. But I must show her brother gold before I can take her away." "What if you had more than pockets full of gold?" asked the beggar. "Well, I would make sure then that anyone who was in need could get it with that gold." And the beggar thought, "This is just the fool I'm looking for." He said, "Young man, you are so spry and nimble. Tonight, the stones will roll away down to the river to drink. They do that only once every 100 years, here on the eve of the New Year. And do you know that they will leave behind holes in the ground full of fairy gold? I am so old, you are so young. Climb into the holes, get the gold, hand it to me. I will put it in bags, and we can carry it away and split it." "You would do that for me," said Bernays. "And more," said the beggar, not mentioning the need of the crow's foot or the 5-leaf clover, and certainly saying nothing about the need of spilt blood upon that heath, lest the gold crumble away the next morning. And so they agreed that they would meet there, and they did that night, late, just as the bells began to ring midnight. The stones began to tip back and forth in their places. Those that were round tumbled out and rolled easily down to the river to drink. Those that were more oblong or rectangular must flop onto their bellies and flip-flop down to the water to drink. And the moonlight shone on fairies' gold there in each of the holes. "Run quickly now," said the old man, handing as many bags as he had brought with them. And Bernays, he climbed down into the first of the holes, and he took some gold and put it in his pockets, and then he filled bag after bag from hole after hole and gave them to the beggar. And then they felt the rumble of the stones returning, and they looked and saw them rolling jealously back towards their fairy hoards of gold. "Run," said Bernays, "we must get out of here. Leave the gold." "I won't leave the gold," said the beggar, "and they won't bother me, for I have crow's foot and a 5-leaved clover, and that will save me from their vengeance. You must run, but I don't think you will outrun the stones." And that was true. They were coming fast. Bernays, he looked this way and he looked that, and he saw that the stones came toward the beggar and then rolled around him, for he had the old magic. And that's when Bernays really began to run, but he tripped and he fell on his face, and he turned over once and looked and then hid his eyes. For the biggest stone of all was rolling toward him, and then it stopped, as though to give him sanctuary. And when he looked, he saw that it was the very stone on which he had carved the cross a week before. And it stood there sheltering him so that the other rocks must roll around it and could not get to the young man. And so they turned round and settled in their places. And the biggest of the stones began to roll across the heath towards the old beggar, who was dragging all the bags and could hardly move a step at a time. And he saw it coming at him, and he held up again the crow's foot and the clover. But the old magic had no power over the new. And the huge stone rolled over him where he stood, and he was no more as it settled into its place. Once he'd captured his breath again, Bernays got up. He walked to the place where he had last seen the beggar, and there was no sign of the man, just his bags of gold. Bernays gathered them and took them back to the small room where he stayed. He threw them on the floor, and he fell upon his bed. And that's where he slept. And in the morning he woke up, and there was gold in his pockets and gold in the bags on the floor. And he went straightway to the house of the farmer in Rosnik, and he showed the gold to the man and was welcomed into the family. And he and Rosnik lived happily together. And because of the gold left to them by the stones of Plouhinec, they saw that no one else in the village was ever in need.